Before we begin, just a reminder of some of the assignments due. A very important discussion on the pneumatology of Luke and Acts, and another one on spirit baptism and spiritual gifts this week. Again, please engage with the authors expressing your own opinion instead of simply retelling the assigned text. You also have your first reflection due by the end of this Unit 4, and the following week your final paper by the end of Unit 5. If all possible, start working on the paper as soon as you're done with your reflections, because the time is short. Thus far, in Theology of the New Testament, we dealt extensively with the concept of biblical theology and original audience in Unit 1, marking spirituality, its source and its community in Unit 2, comparison to the other two synoptics and the fourth gospel, Bach's quest for the historical Jesus, and briefly on Q-source while discussing original audience. Then, in the Gospel of Matthew, we saw the teaching and eschatological restoration of kingdom ethics and standard. We further looked into the Gospel of John as being more narrative than theological, and the specifically interesting to many Pentecostal scholars already not yet tension which seems to follow the whole Johannine corpus. Following that, our favorite author Bauckham introduced the writing of John in a comparison and contrast with other apocalyptic literature, viewing Revelation as climax of Old Testament prophecy, and John himself as a continuation of the Old Testament apocalyptic tradition. And now we arrive at a very important pneumatological text in the New Testament, namely the Lucian corpus, containing Luke's Gospel and Acts of the Apostles. Both are written as a collective narrative based on extensive historical research Luke has done on the life of Jesus and then on the early days of the church in Acts. First and foremost, why is Luke so important to the New Testament pneumatology or the theology of the Holy Spirit? Because Luke provides a much needed continuity between the baptism with the Holy Spirit professed by Jesus after his resurrection in Luke chapter 20 and the infilling of the apostles with the Holy Spirit in Acts chapter 2 and so on. The apostolic baptism is followed by similar experiences with the Gentiles in Samaria in Acts chapter 8, the Apostle Paul in chapter 9, some say, then in the house of Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, the Ephesians, and so on. Significant for this continuity is its initiation with the empowerment of the Messianic Son of God, as expressed by Max Turner's text. By recognizing the Markian source which Luke uses, we are quickly introduced to the Q source containing additional information to the Synoptic Gospels. While Q is made reference mainly in the footnotes, the reduction conclusions remain central to the main argument in the text. So, the story in Luke, who is not a direct witness to the baptism of Jesus, is a collaboration of various witnesses within the Lucan tradition. Luke combines and edits all the original information in one story, which he calls a narrative, a discourse, or even a book in some of the more modern translations. The reductions and the exclusions made by Luke to the baptism discourse are noted as stylistics rather than theological, although they may have some theological moment as well. Firstly, while the Jewish tradition looked toward the messianic restoration of the old Davidic kingdom, Luke is going one step further, announcing a new kingdom nexus. Surprisingly, this messianic annunciation is not followed by immediate royal enthronement, but a vigorous spiritual test. Jesus is tested in the desert, led there by no one else, but by the Spirit who the reader had just witnessed in his baptism at the River Jordan. While Markian tradition compares the temptation of Christ with the temptation of Adam, Luke, possibly citing the Q source, parallels the temptation of Christ with the journey of Israel through the desert. Ultimately, Luke presents us with one new spiritual exodus. Having passed the temptation, Jesus returns from the desert full with the Holy Spirit and enters kingdom ministry unprecedented in Israel's history. The Spirit, who has both brought and aided Christ in the desert, is now leading him in a final victorious triumph over curse, sickness, demons, and all the powers of darkness. Having established the opening episode in the ministry of Jesus, we are now presented by a complete Luke-Act soteriology of the kingdom by Matera's text. But salvation in Luke-Acts is not merely the Matthean fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies or the far distant Johannine in the beginning God. once having established the ministry of Jesus in the Spirit, Luke presents us with a soteriology that is deeply pneumatical, and not merely a New Testament one. The prophecy cited by Jesus in Acts 4 draws from Isaiah's pneumatic experience and prophetic Old Testament proclamation, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." This proclamation is not only now fulfilled, but will continue to be present in every aspect of salvation, regeneration, and reunification of the creation with God. The Spirit is not only present in every step of the ministry, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus, but continues, progresses, and is ever present in every step of the salvific experience of Christ's disciples and every else their kingdom message has touched. After revealing this unity and continuity between Luke and Acts, Matthäus' text calls for covenant community of disciples, following the model of the Old Testament covenant relationship between Israel and God. This idea is directly expressed in Luke's Christology. The new Exodus is now complete in the salvation brought by the Messiah, and will continue to transform the people into a new covenant of restoring the kingdom until the outpouring of the glory of God on the day of Pentecost, just like the glory appeared to the generations of Moses, David, Solomon, and the restored nation of Israel under Ezra and Nehemiah. We're now brought to the theological unity of Luke and Acts. If for Luke the Gospel is the beginning of Christology, quite naturally Acts is the completion of Christology. The wait is over. The so long-awaited salvation is being fulfilled, not in some prophetic and distant future, but while the reader is introduced to the story of Jesus and the story of the early church. And very early in the apostolic ministry of Acts, we are introduced to Luke's novel idea that the salvation of Israel is also the salvation of all other nations. The church for Luke is not separate in the Spirit. On the day of Pentecost, they're all in one accord, the Bible calls it. All hear the good news of God's great works. The Spirit is poured on all flesh. The apostles, meaning the sent ones, are sent to Judea, Galilee, Samaria, and to all the world. All who receive the salvation of Messiah are part of the people of God, the community of disciples, the called ones, or the ecclesia. This unity within the new covenant comes with newly addressed beneficiaries and freshly presented spiritual gifts. Which brings us to our final read for the week on the gifts of the Spirit. It is peculiar to note right away that the text requires not the salvation itself, but salvation followed by the Holy Spirit baptism as the understood gateway to the gifts of the Spirit. Meaning, the gifts of the Spirit do not operate outside of the experience of salvation and the Holy Spirit baptism. This classical Pentecostal gateway position is challenged by the Third Wave movement and many modern-day charismatics, which raises the question, can we really separate the pneumatic experience from the gifts of the Spirit? Or should they operate both theologically and practically within the scope of the unity of this same Spirit? The text lists three main obstacles to this interpretation, compares the views of Paul and Luke before concluding that for Luke and the Lucan community, the Spirit is the exclusive source of the gifts and the power of God, which cannot operate apart from the Spirit Himself. On the Pauline side of pneumatology, we're presented with a discussion on Spirit terminology, namely a comparison and contrast between Paul's use of the Greek words pneumatica and charismata. The conclusion of the chapter leaves us with some questions. Is it true that only the prophetic cluster of the 9 gifts require Spirit baptism? They are listed there: word of knowledge, word of wisdom, discernment of spirits, speaking in tongues, and interpretation of tongues. It is also peculiar that the actual gift of prophecy is not listed among those so-called prophetic gifts, but also faith, healing, and miracles, called great works in some of the translations. Why are they omitted in the pneumatic list? Can gifts be operated without the power of the Spirit baptism? Does such operation not take away the whole pneumatic Spirit-filled idea from the pneumatic Spirit-given gifts? This and many other questions about Luke Acts theology we will have chance to talk about in the upcoming discussions.